All right, good. We're finally online. So today we're going to talk a little bit about ethnobotanical methods. So we've read and we've heard about some fascinating studies from around the world in some really interesting places. So we're going to learn a little bit about how that sausage is made. So what goes into actually conducting an ethnobotanical research project. And we're going to do this as a segue into discussing your final project for this class, which is this family interview project, right? So again, remind you the worksheets are due this Friday. This final written assignment is due towards the end of the class, so it's due on the 29th of December. November. Sorry, November 29th. And this one you actually turn in on La Lima, so you don't have to print it out. You can just submit it online under the assignments tab. You see where you can turn that in. And it's worth a lot of points. So it's worth a quarter of your grade for this class. And it will seem to you that it's sort of maybe out. It's worth more than it should be, considering how long the assignment is. So it's not a particularly big assignment or a long assignment. It's just an important assignment. So I want you to put a lot of thought into it and some time, not actually writing it, but conducting the research and thinking about the questions that you want to ask your own family member. Now the point of it, and I alluded to this when we did that role-playing game on Explorers Day, is that a lot of skills and knowledge is lost in ethnobotany. So sometimes the plants stick around. Plant extinctions are relatively rare compared to extinctions of things like languages or knowledge of plant uses. And one of the only ways that is able to be perpetuated, that knowledge remains, is by having it passed down from generation to generation. Now, we're a literate society. Everybody in this room can read and write, so some things are written down. So it may be that you can go to the library and read about some use from some culture of some plant. However, a lot of things aren't written down for one reason or another. Maybe people don't want this knowledge in the public domain. Maybe people don't think it's important at the time. Or maybe people think that a use is so commonplace and everyday that there's no way that people would someday forget it, right? Like, think about what's a real common medicinal plant that we all use without even thinking about it. I think about like aloe vera used on sunburns, right? You get a sunburn, you go get some aloe, and you spread it on your skin. None of us would bother to write that down. It seems totally unremarkable. But in 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, that may be seen as sort of an archaic or old use of a plant. And so passing that knowledge on is not something that we should take for granted. So the idea is that each of you will go and interview at least one person from your family from an older generation. So that could be your parents, it could be your grandparents, it could be an auntie or an uncle, whomever. It could be multiple people. And I know that there's probably some of you in this room that are maybe estranged from your parents or from your true family, or maybe you're orphaned, and so that's okay. Just talk to somebody who you're close to. Ideally it would be a biological family member. Otherwise, somebody that the people that raised you or the people that you have learned from or maybe grew up with. Those people are around. But it should be somebody from an older generation. And I want you to ask them about their plant use and their knowledge of plants and see what you learn. Now, we've been learning a lot about indigenous cultures and indigenous people, how they use plants. So some of you who grew up maybe in the Midwest, like I did, don't really think about ethnobotany in our families. So I get a lot of this, like, oh, well, my family didn't really use plants, right? I grew up in Chicago, in the middle of the city, which is where I grew up. Plants was not something that we spent a lot of time around the dinner table talking about. But the more you think about it and the more you learn about ethnobotany, the more you realize that these plants are part of our everyday life. So maybe you had a small garden. My mom had a small rose garden in our backyard. I didn't really think much of it until I asked her, and she said, oh, well, she got into roses because her mother was into roses, and she planted these roses during World War II because it was promoted by the White House that people should plant what are known as victory gardens because rose hips have a lot of vitamin C. And there was the fear that with rationing and with food shortages that people wouldn't be able to get enough vitamin C. So it was encouraged that people start growing roses in their backyards. And this is why my mom is very into growing roses, right? Maybe you didn't have a garden, maybe you grew up in an apartment. I'm sure you ate lots of holiday meals. And I'm sure those holiday meals had all sorts of foods that you counted on and that you probably still count on today. You know, just think about Thanksgiving and all of those ingredients that go into a Thanksgiving dinner and all of those vegetables that you look forward to. And maybe it's the only time that you ever eat sweet potatoes, but every year, once a year, you eat as many sweet potatoes as you can cram down your gullet, right? So each one of you has some relationship with plants, even if it's not, medical or ceremonial. Each of you has some relationship with plants that you probably shared with somebody from an older generation. And so this project is the opportunity for you to sit down and talk about those plants and maybe how that use has changed. Now, the project itself it's only a 5-page paper. We're not looking for you to go on and on and on and describing Thanksgiving dinner. It's not the point of it. The point is, again, it's this process and to sort of take a step into the shoes of an ethnobotanist and learn to do this type of research for yourself and connect with your family. Take a look at the rubric because there are several components that we're asking for, and each one of those components is assigned a point value. So if you follow the rubric and you're very careful that you actually check all of those boxes, there's no reason that each and every one of you shouldn't get 100% on this assignment. Again, you don't have to be an amazing writer. You don't have to present remarkable research or insights. You just have to follow the directions, and you'll do great. The rubric looks a little something like this. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 main components. And each one of them, you see how the points are breaking down, and maximum number of points you can get for that category, minimum number of points you can get for that category is always 0, right? But this is how we're going to grade it, me and the TA. So there should be no surprises. The components look like this. It'll be a brief introduction, some sort of research question or hypothesis, a description of the methods used, and that's what we're going to talk about today is methods in ethnobotany, some sort of results, and then some sort of discussion of those results. Now, the introduction doesn't have to be very long. You don't have to expound all the other research that's been done on this topic in the past. Just talk about a general justification for why you chose the subject that you chose. You've always been fascinated in how Uncle Kimo maintains like all these different varieties of mango, and you wanted to know what motivated him. You were interested to know how your mother's knowledge of medicinal plants changed from her mother's knowledge of medicinal plants, and why there was a greater emphasis on plants that are in the mint family. Whatever it is, talk about why you chose that topic and how this is important to you. You should have some sort of research question or hypothesis, right? So this is, it's not just, I decided to go sit down and talk to, my grandpa about plants one day. You should say, I sat down and talked to my grandpa about plants one day in order to find out whether or not they knew about using aloe vera before World War II. Okay, so it should be a question or a hypothesis. And the difference between those two things is subtle. We're not going to get into it here. You can state a question as a question. Did they use aloe vera before World War II? Or you can state it as a hypothesis, which is falsifiable if you're scientifically inclined. Either one of those is fine, but make sure it's clear. And to make double sure that it's clear in your paper, bold it and underline it so that the people that are grading it know what your question was, know what your hypothesis was, and so that it's clear to you also what question it is that you're addressing, because you're going to want to circle back to that in your results and your discussion. You're going to want to describe the methods that you use. So we're going to talk about some of those methods today. As a good rule of thumb, to have a solid set of descriptive methods, somebody should be able to replicate your study. So somebody should be able to read your paper, read your methods section, say, okay, so this person, when the author of this paper went and interviewed this person, this person, this person, at this time of day, and asked them this question, and this is how they recorded their results. And you should be able to take that piece of paper, follow those directions, and then come up with the same results that the interviewee came with. Of course, someone else's grandpa might not be as willing to talk to you as they were to talk to their own grandson or granddaughter, but that's the general rule of thumb. When we write up methods for some of the lab work that we do, we talk about the quantity, the temperature, the order of things that were added to a mixture to get a reaction. And it should be a standalone document that somebody can go back 10 years from now and follow to the letter and enable to replicate those results. Things that you can mention in your methods is if you asked a certain number of questions, you can list those questions. You want to say sort of where the interview took place, if it was over the phone, if it was in person, what time of day, what were the circumstances, who else was around, was it at a party, was it a one-on-one thing that you set up, if it was a questionnaire that you had people fill out, why don't you add in a copy of that questionnaire, things like that, so that it could be replicated in the future. Results are really just the data. So this is the answer to your questions. This is the stories that were elicited. This is what you learned. If you're doing a quantitative study, this would be a data table. And finally, a discussion of the results. And this is rehashing, going back to your introduction and saying, so I was interested in this topic because of this. Here's what I actually learned about this topic that I was interested in. Here's how this relates to our original hypothesis or question. The question was answered, and yes, they used aloe vera before World War II. And that's interesting because I knew that aloe vera was from Central America, and this must mean that it came to Hawaii before World War II, for example. So what you learned, why that's important to you, and sort of what that means to you personally. And you can also use the discussion to relate this topic to other things that other people have found. Now, we don't want this to be a research paper in that we don't want you to go to the library, pull out a bunch of sources, and find out what other people have written about aloe vera in the literature. This should be something very personal. So it's a research paper in the sense that you are researching your family and your family's use of medical plants, or use of plants, not to be medical, but it's not a research paper in the sense that you go to the library and find a bunch of other sources, right? That's the general gist, and again, it should be 5 pages more or less. You have the reason that I have it due towards the end of the class is this will give you a chance to learn about all these different aspects of ethnobotany. So we've covered things like non-timber forest products. We're going to study ritual plants, medicinal plants, food plants. And it also gives you time to interview people over Thanksgiving, because I know that's a good opportunity for a lot of people to connect with family members, especially from those older generations. So between now and then, start thinking about topics, things that are interesting to you, things about plants that you always saw your mom or dad using, but weren't sure what they were or why they were using them. If you're unsure of a topic, you can bounce ideas off of me. But start thinking about this and really aim to have your interviews conducted by Thanksgiving break, on or before Thanksgiving break. And all of the directions and that rubric for this paper are posted on Laulima under the written assignments tab. So you can see exactly what the components of this paper are and how it's going to be graded. So any questions about that assignment? Okay, well, I will keep bugging you guys about it from now until the time that it's due. So I won't let you forget. And remember, it's worth like a good quarter of your grade, so it pays to take it seriously. So moving on then, let's talk about methods. Now the first thing that I want to mention about ethnobotanical methods is that any sort of research that involves human subjects, and this could be an anthropology study or a sociology study, it could be an ethnobotanical study, it could be a medical study, anything that involves people has to pass through this ethics board known as the Institutional Review Board. And interestingly enough, they're just around the corner here in Biomed building, so you can go knock on the door and introduce yourself if you want to. But this is every study that involves human subjects has to get cleared by this board. We don't have to for our class and for this class project, but if you were going to do some research, like for a UROP project or for an honors project, you would have to go through the IRB. You have to submit a paperwork. You have to submit a bunch of paperwork, and they'll either okay it or not. And they have all sorts of stipulations, like data that you collect about people has to be randomized. So if you're taking notes about someone in a notebook, that data has to be anonymous, so that if somebody stole your notebook or if you lost it and somebody found it, they wouldn't be able to tie that data back to individual people. You have to make sure that people won't be harmed, right? That there won't be any risk. You have to state how people will be benefited. So all of this, it's a long laundry list of sort of legalese, ethical clearances. And then if you answer any of these email questionnaires, like I get a bunch of these every week. Each of them will say certain things that now that you've read the IRB clearance, you know why they say that. They always have to say how long that's going to take, right? Oh, this survey will only take you about 3 minutes. It'll tell you what you'll get out of it. So, and participation, you'll get entered into a drawing for an Amazon gift card, right? They have to tell you if it's going to harm you in any way potentially. Usually doing an online survey won't, unless you're giving, some sort of sensitive information about medical history or saying something bad about a teacher that could result in like a bad grade for you or something. All that has to be stated, right? So the key part of this IRB is making sure that, I took it out. Making sure that you have this, this document that's known as the informed consent. And it has to state, again, the benefit to the person that you are studying, if there is going to be a benefit, the harm to that person that you're studying, if there is going to be some sort of harm, how long it's going to take them to participate, and you have to tell them that that participation is optional, right? So that people can opt out for any reason that they want to at any time. Now, something as innocuous as an interview asking somebody about plants doesn't seem like there ought to be a lot of harm to it, right? But there could be some unintended consequences. So who can think about asking Grandpa about aloe vera? How could that be potentially harmful to Grandpa? I don't know. It seems flimsy, right? It doesn't seem like there could be much harm to him. And so if there's nothing really plausibly that's going to harm Grandpa, you don't have to warn him about it. You could say, oh, I'm going to ask you some questions about World War II, and it might be traumatic to think about or relive some of those memories, right? What are some benefits to Grandpa interviewing him about aloe vera? Yeah, so I'm going to interview you about aloe vera. Maybe you'll learn something in the process. I'm going to record the data. It's going to go into this project. I'll give you a copy. Your great grandkids someday will be able to read it if they want to and have a nice memory of you. Anyway, this is the type of stuff that you have to let people know before you include them in an interview, right? So let's talk about sort of the backbone of any good ethnobotanical study is really this interview process, right? So can I get a volunteer from our audience? Maybe somebody sitting in the back. That make me pick somebody. You have 5 seconds. I'm gonna pick somebody. Okay, thank you. Come on down. Have a seat. Sorry. So we're gonna have to speak up a little bit. Can you project? You can't project?
Try.
Here, then why don't you take the mic and I'll project. You can just clip it onto your shirt there. All right, thanks. What's your name?
Rocky.
Rocky. Hi, Rocky. I'm Anthony Amond. I teach ethnobotany class. There's about 120 people in this class. Do you mind if I ask you a couple questions about some plants?
It's fine.
Okay, so it'll take maybe 10 minutes of your time. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. You might embarrass yourself in front of your classmates. You probably won't. But participating, you'll learn something about the interview process. Does that sound okay? Can you guys hear me in the back even without my microphone? If not, you can move up. We have lots of seats up here. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about plants. I'm going to start with something that's called an open-ended question type. Okay. Tell me about this plant.
I have no idea what it is.
Okay.
It's orange.
It's orange. Good. Okay. Thanks, Rocky. That's great. Yeah, it's a plant. It's orange, and that's something that you might hear if you ask an open-ended question like that, right? So we call these open questions, and open questions are just that. They're totally open. I sort of introduce a broad, vague topic, a plant, and then I ask my interviewee, Rocky, to tell me about it, right? And she tells me whatever she wants to about it. She tells me it's orange. That's great. She tells me she doesn't know what it is, which is also great. So those are 2 pieces of information that she volunteered. So what's an advantage to an open question like that if you're going to go about an interview? Yeah.
You're not going to have to consider all potential answers and then deal with if your options aren't available to what you want to answer.
Okay, sure. So I'm not limiting my interviewee, right? So she can tell me whatever she wants to, right? And it's not filtered by my preconceived ideas about this plant, right? So I'm not limiting her wisdom in that interview. What's maybe a downside to this interview? Do you have another advantage?
I was just to say it helps to direct future questions too, because you better understand the knowledge of things.
Okay, so I start big and then I go small. So by starting big, I sort of see what Rocky's, knowledge limits are about this plant, right? So I can sort of gauge the rest of my interview, maybe. Yeah, that's another good thing about it. What's maybe a drawback to using open questions? Yeah. Yeah, so maybe the information that I get isn't totally relevant to what I wanted to know. So I actually was super interested in, anti-cancer phytochemistry of legume plants. And Rocky told me that it was orange, right? So totally off subject, not what I was really interested in. It's not her fault. I just didn't direct her in that interview, right? So open-ended can be good, maybe a good way to get started. Maybe a good way, if you have no idea what your interviewee knows about a subject, a good way to sort of let them drive the ship at first. But yeah, you could end up in some weird places or some weird discussions, right? So pluses and minuses. So let's talk about an indirect question. So Rocky, I've heard about these plants that you can smoke. And, do you know anything about that?
No, of course not.
Okay, so that's what we call an indirect question, right? So I was alluding to something, but I was sort of beating around the bush a little bit. I didn't flat out ask Rocky about, illicit plants or some other thing, right? I sort of put it out there for her, but I gave her an easy out if she didn't want to go there with me, right? So that's an indirect question. An advantage to an indirect question is that we both save face, right? So we both sort of knew what I was talking about, but she can say, oh, I don't really know what you're talking about. She has an out. She doesn't have to admit or not admit anything. We can forget it ever happened, right? We can forget that question ever happened, right? So it's a good way for asking about sensitive topics. Now, for you guys, that might be a sensitive topic. If you're interviewing, some indigenous cultures about sacred plants or medicinal plants or valuable plants like non-timber forest product plants that are worth a lot of money, those might be questions that people don't feel comfortable answering. But instead of just shutting down the interview and saying, I don't want to answer your questions, strange guy, go away, they can be like, yeah, not sure. What's your next question, right? So it's a tightrope walk that we can do, a dance that we can do. So that's an indirect question, not stating the question directly, but implying a question. Now, there's also something that's known as a leading question, right? And this is something like this. So you've been taking this class now for a month, so you obviously know that this is a really important medicinal plant, right? Obviously.
If you say so.
Okay, so that's a leading question. So I don't ask her about her knowledge. I ask her to verify something that I've already stated, right? I've led her to an answer. Now this can be problematic, especially if you're not used to doing this type of research or asking people questions or doing interview type data gathering. It can be problematic. Now, I'll give you an example. When I lived in Nepal, so I spent my junior year of college, I went abroad and lived in Nepal for a while. Nepal is one of these cultures. People are super friendly. People are super nice. And people are incredibly embarrassed to ever say no to you. And so it's the last thing. It's really embarrassing to say no to somebody. People want to make you happy. People like to smile. People like to say yes. People do not like to say no. If you go up and ask somebody, is this the bus that goes to Kirtipur? The answer invariably will be yes. People want to make you happy. People want to say yes. So if you ask, is this the bus that goes to Kirtipur? Yes. Is this the trail that'll take you to Bangalore? Yes. Yes. Always yes, right? So that leading question can be very problematic. People want to please you, right? And so I ask Rocky. Rocky has a very strong personality, so she won't tell me no. But somebody with a weaker disposition, I say, this is obviously a medicinal plant. You knew that already, right? Yeah, I knew that. Of course. I'm not an idiot. I knew that this is a medicinal plant, right? So that's the idea of a leading question. So you have to be sort of careful about asking a leading question where you are feeding the answer to your subject, right? So there's clear disadvantages to asking leading questions. What could be a possible advantage to asking a leading question? How can you use this to your benefit? Yeah.
Getting nice skewed data to support your study.
Okay, sure. So I had a preconceived hypothesis that I wanted to prove. I could totally feed people answers and get that data, right? That would be maybe unethical. It would certainly be bad science. But yep, I could use a leading question in that way. And pollsters do that all the time, right? These left-leaning or right-leaning polls that want to support a candidate or some sort of political viewpoint often use leading questions to skew their polls in one direction or the other. What could be another advantage to using a leading question? So I can think of a couple examples. So let's say I wanted to test Rocky's reliability as an informant, right? So I wanted to see whether or not she's lying to me. And there's lots of cases where people have gone back. The first people that described taro varieties in Hawaii, the Handies, they went and they asked all these taro growers about all these different taro varieties that Hawaiians were growing in Lo'i. And the answers were given in Hawaiian, and so the handies wrote them down. We're like, okay, this is the Hawaiian name. This is the Hawaiian name of this taro variety. And it's not until more recently that people have gone back to those records and looked at some of those taro names and have seen all sorts of what they call kalohe answers, right? Or sort of rascal answers where people are like go away, haole, variety of taro, right? And so people just didn't want to answer this guy's question. They humored him. They thought it was funny. So I could ask a question that I already know the answer to, and see, and I know that Rocky knows the answer to, and see if she's going to actually, answer my questions in a real way or in a sort of a joking way. And if she answers the question that I know the answer to and that I know she knows the answer to in a sneaky way, I can take her answers with a grain of salt, right? So that's one way that you can use a leading question effectively. Another thing is that when you're talking to somebody about something that you know like a ton about, like a lot about, and you're talking to some novice, right? Sometimes you might, consciously or not, think that it's really not worth your while to engage with this person, right? So think about, if you're a sports fan, maybe you start talking about the National League Championships and the Cubs and the Dodgers and somebody maybe knows the teams involved, but they don't know who the players are. They haven't been watching the Cubs all season like I have. And you just realize this conversation is going nowhere. So you sort of humor them and then walk away. Maybe you're expert about like video games, right? And so you start talking to somebody about video games. They're not at your level, so you're not going to bother engaging them. I can use leading questions to sort of prove that I know something about this subject, that I know enough about this subject to make it worth Rocky's while to actually have a conversation with me. We're talking about ethnobotany. I can prove that I know enough about plants that she can actually treat me as a peer, or that she can actually, talk to me at a technical level that'll actually derive some higher level meaning out of our conversation than her just humoring me as a novice. And so asking leading questions that prove that I know something can actually get somebody to engage that they otherwise wouldn't, right? So that's how you can use a leading question. Be very careful with the leading question because more often than not, it'll just get you in trouble, I think. So the next one that we're going to talk about is a closed question, right? So this is a question where I'm forcing Rocky to give me some type of categorical answer, right? So is this a medical plant?
I do not.
Okay, I don't know. So there's three possible answers that she could have given me. It could have been yes, it could have been no, it could have been I don't know. So this is as restricted as it gets. So compare that with an open question like tell me about this plant to a closed question, yes, no, I don't know. They're much different types of answers that you'll get, right? A closed question really narrows her response, right? So there's only so many ways that she can go with that. So if I wanted to ask 120 students in this class that question and get a distribution of the percentage of students that think, yes, it's a medicinal plant, no, it's not a medicinal plant, I don't know if it's a medicinal plant or not, then asking that type of closed question will give me that data distribution that I want. So especially if I want to do some sort of quantitative analysis, like do more girls compared to boys think that this is a medical plant. I can ask those closed questions and get a discrete response that lends itself to comparing answers directly among groups or among people, and also coming up with some sort of quantitative analysis for my data, if that's something that interested me, right? So that's a closed question. So I went over 5 different types of questions: open questions, indirect questions, leading questions, and then closed questions. And does anybody have any questions about my questions? Those 5 types of questions. And so mastering these different question types is an important art, and learning to do it will actually really improve your interviewing skills. So this is something that gets better over time. And intuition can guide you, but planning can also guide you, right? So thinking ahead of time the types of questions that you want to ask for the types of analyses that you want to do can really make your research go much smoother, right? Do you have any questions for me?
What is that?
What is this? Yes, I knew you were going to ask this. So this is, they call this one the Royal Poinciana tree, Collinvillia racemosa. So it's native to Madagascar, and it blooms once a year for about 2 weeks, and it's blooming right now, right outside my office, which is why I got it. And it's not particularly useful. I just thought it was really beautiful, so I decided to bring it in. But it's in the legume family. Here, you can keep this as a memento for your help. I'll pass these out. And you can take a look. The bees love them too, so I hope there's no bees on them still. I picked them a while ago, so the bees should have disappeared. But yeah, the whole tree is bright orange. So everybody give Rocky a big round of applause. What's that? You weren't supposed to know what it was. No, you're a very good sport. So those are questions, and so most years, most of the interviews or the research papers that we get involve some sort of interview, right? Which involves asking a question of one of those types or some combination of those types, right? Now it doesn't have to be this. I sit here, he or she sits there, and I ask questions and write down the answer. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. We mentioned questionnaires. You guys have all probably seen or maybe filled out some of these questionnaires. You'll do it at the end of this class. You'll evaluate, how you liked this class and how the assignments were and whether or not you learned what you thought you were going to learn on a scale of 1 to 5 with your eCafe. So you guys are familiar with those. They're very limiting. They consist entirely of closed questions, but they're great because you can complete a million of them really quickly, and then you can compare answers easily in an Excel spreadsheet. And there's other types of quantitative analyses that you can do as well, right? So let's say I wanted to see how ethnicity or gender affected people's perception of food plants, right? I could ask everybody, right now to get out their iClicker, to go on a Google spreadsheet and rank these plants in order, from most delicious to least delicious. And depending on, where you grew up or how familiar you are with some of these fruits, you'd rank these plants, right? And I could get an interesting distribution of plant rankings, and then I could correlate that with some topic or variable of interest, right? So that's one other sort of quantitative thing that you can do is you can have people rank plants. And maybe your ranking looked like this. Anybody rank their plants like this? Nobody thinks banana is the most delicious. That's my hypothesis. You can also do things like this, and this is something that's pretty easy. It's a good way. Typically, this is called recall, and it's a good measure of plant knowledge, right? So, how many NTFP can you list in 60 seconds? On your marks, get set, go, right? And you can ask somebody to do that. You can write down the number. Maybe the names of the plants don't matter. Maybe the actual identity of the plants isn't important. You just want to see how many they can list. And your hypothesis is that people that are older will be able to list more NTFP than people that are younger. And then you ask your family these questions, and you just get a number, and you can correlate that with age, and see whether or not there's a linear relationship. You can do this with medical plants, right? You can say, list as many plants as you can that are in the mint family. How many plants can you list that are growing in your backyard? How many plants can you name that are sitting on this table here in front of us? You can bring a bunch of demonstrations of plants, right? So this is another way to get quantitative data from informants. There's all sorts of fun methods that people have come up with for like pairing. So people do the card sorting. So you can either have picture cards, especially if you don't share a language with people, or people like to have some sort of visual cue, pictures of these plants, or you can actually have the plants in front of you and say, which of these two plants is most similar. Go ahead, why don't you guys look at this right now? Take a second. Which of these two plants is most similar? How many people, raise your hand if you thought that the tomato and the potato were most similar? Nobody? You sort of thought that? How many people thought the tomato and the blueberry were most similar? Most of you, because you all took the fruit lab, so you know that they're both berries, right? Very good. Anybody think that the potato and the blueberry was most similar? Yeah, okay. Sort of interesting, sort of not. If you use different examples, you could sort of rank people's how they start to think about plants and their relationships to each other, right? And how they're categorizing plants. Tomato and potato, by the way, are in the same plant family, right? They're both Solanaceae, so phylogenetically, those two are much more similar. But we're not thinking phylogenetically, right? We're thinking about eating, so not as important. Last, I want to talk a little bit about the setting. So the setting matters, right? So Rocky in my interview maybe would have been a lot different if we were, sitting in my office and I was wearing a white lab coat, and I had some sort of like heart rate monitor on her wrist, right? It would have been totally different if we'd been sitting at a bar. It would have been different if we were sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table. So that setting really matters, and it can affect how people answer questions and how open they are. And that's why recording that is really important in your methods, because that'll impact the types of information that you receive. And think about that when you conduct these research interviews yourself. Think about the setting and how that will benefit or maybe hinder the type of information that you want to get. Right? And you don't have to do these one-on-one either. You can have a group of people together and ask questions of a group. Although there's always going to be somebody that's super outspoken, there's always going to be somebody that's more reserved, right? So you have to deal with group dynamics. But that can be interesting too. Maybe somebody would feel uncomfortable one-on-one, but if they have the, sort of the permission of the whole group to answer questions about certain types of plants, maybe they'll be more open, right? And then lastly, you can conduct this type of research, without even saying a word. So your Chinatown project was in essence sort of one of these research projects where you learned about people and plants and how they interact without necessarily even having to talk to anybody. So going and observing plants that people are being used without talking to them can also be an effective way of learning about people and the types of plants that they use. So that's my whirlwind recap of methods. You're going to go over some more methods in lab this week. So if you didn't catch all the nuances this time around, it's okay. You'll get another chance. And I have a little bit of time for questions before we go. And you can ask about interviews or research techniques or about the paper too. It's a good opportunity to ask about that paper. Thanks, guys. See you Wednesday.